Hello and welcome to the Association for Coaching podcast. My name's Darren Robson and I'm your host for this health and wellbeing series. Today I'm having a discussion with Stephen Baguley. So Stephen, welcome to the podcast.
Hi Darren, thanks very much for having me.
So Stephen, look, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. We're going to be discussing health and wellbeing in the workplace and drawing on your experience as a psychologist and as a coach and also as an academic. But before we do that, why don't you just introduce yourself?
Okay, thanks Darren. So my name's Stephen Baguley and I currently work as an Accredited Executive Coach with the Association for Coaching. My background is that I trained and worked for 10 years as a psychologist in the Criminal Justice Service, originally working as a forensic psychologist and then more recently retraining as a counselling psychologist. So I have a background working in the NHS as well. About 8 years or so ago, I had a bit of a career change. So I moved into higher education, working at a university now. And I've recently started doing a part-time PhD exploring mindfulness and well-being in the workplace as well. So I do that alongside teaching on a postgraduate certificate in professional coaching at the university and a role within the business school.
Wonderful. Looking forward to digging into that a bit more. And I know one of the things that you're interested in is around the historical and traditional perspective of coaching in the workplace. So why don't you just set that context?
Yes, thank you. So I think one of the things that I find really interesting coming into coaching relatively recently has been having perhaps a slightly fresher perspective or a different perspective on coaching within the workplace. And one of the things that really interested me was an article that David Clutterbuck wrote last year, looking at coaching and the challenges around coaching remaining relevant. And it made me think quite a bit about my experience of coaching within the workplace. So there's a couple of things that have really stood out for me, Darren. One has been that from maybe a traditional perspective, my sense of coaching within the workplace is it's had a fairly limited scope. And there seems to have been quite a strong focus traditionally on working with senior leadership clients, working with people in senior positions, so-called E-suite client groups. And so there's been this limited scope in terms of who's actually able to access coaching. And I think there's also been quite a strong focus in my experience with coaching around coaching being a very doing mode approach. And by that, it's been very solution focused. There's been a lot of focus on performance and there's been a lot of focus on end products and goals as well. And that's quite different to how I've worked for the majority of my career when I was working as a psychologist, which was more, I'd call it more sort of being in the being mode around how clients learn to understand their behaviours and their circumstances and gain a greater understanding and acceptance around some of those things as well.
Wonderful. And we'll pick up a bit more on that in a minute. And what do you see as some of the current challenges that we're facing in the workplace? And I know with you, the good thing is that you've got a foot in the sort of commercial side, but also in the public sector. So you've got a nice rounded view. So what are some of the things that you're seeing in the workplace?
Yes, I probably should have mentioned I also do coaching privately with clients as well. I forgot to mention that originally. So I think obviously the main one, which I know other guests on the podcast have spoken about, is the challenges of COVID at the moment. Over the last year, which has placed an incredible amount of stress and pressure on people working in the workplace, in the public and private sectors as well. For me, that's been particularly relevant. I work as a coach and a mentor at Montfort University as well as doing teaching on the coaching programme. So we're dealing with some of the challenges for staff of how they manage working from home, as I've been, a lot of people have since last March. Challenges around staff having to move provision online in terms of teaching, which has been created different sorts of challenges, I think, for staff. Obviously, there's challenges for the students at university as well. So COVID's really turned things upside down in terms of how we work and how we experience workplace pressure and stress. I think maybe on a longer term perspective as well, my interests around workplace coaching are also linked to working in the public sector and issues around austerity. And this goes back all the way to when I was working in the prisons and probation service. And this experience that a lot of staff who work in the public sector will have, I imagine, experienced too, around being asked to do more for less resources and the pressures that are placed on the workforce as a result of that as well. So I'm interested in issues around stress-related absences, which have been on the increase year on year. It's something that's been flagged by people like the World Health Organization as a public health issue for society increasingly, and the challenges around workloads as well, how staff manage those kind of pressures within the workplace from an organisational perspective, but also from an individual perspective as well.
Yeah, so the picture you paint there is one that's very realistic for a lot of people. And I've also heard within the difficulties, there's also great opportunities. So when you look at this challenge that is being faced by a lot of our colleagues, friends, family members at the moment in workplaces, what do you see as some of the opportunities for coaching to support and then the coaching profession?
In terms of opportunities, coaching, it feels like it's at a really interesting place. And it feels like the challenges, some of the limitations that I mentioned before, are being reevaluated in terms of where coaching can go as a profession. So I think within the workplace, there are huge opportunities to expand the scope of coaching beyond performance-related focus, beyond working with leadership and working with senior executives, and providing greater access for coaching at all levels of an organisation. And I'm really proud to say that's something that we're doing at Montfort University, and we've set up and are rolling out a coaching service which provides access to coaching support for staff at all different levels. And which, again, going back to this fantastic article that I read a while ago from David Clutterbuck, he refers to this as the democratisation of coaching. And I think this is, for me, that's a fantastic opportunity for the profession to really start to extend its provision. So I think that would be one thing. The second thing would be a change of focus, or what I might call a paradigm shift in terms of what coaching is and isn't, and the benefits of coaching. And this is where I'm really interested in mindfulness, for example, as an alternative approach to working with people, and one that really taps more into what we call the relational space in coaching. So what's actually happening between the coach and the client, what's happening for the client within that session that's reflecting what's going on outside of that session, and a real opportunity to focus on this idea of being rather than doing. So this idea of being mode, which is about recognizing and acknowledging things that are happening without necessarily having to come up with solutions and ways of moving past or dealing with it. I think there's also something there around how we challenge this idea of an article I read recently, Darren, which is around toxic positivity in the workplace. So this idea that we need to reframe experiences as being positive wherever possible, and we have to be able to reframe things in a way that moves people forward. And I think that's something that actually can be quite disempowering for people who just want to have their experience heard. And I think that can be potentially something that traditional coaching is at risk of doing at times. Not necessarily on a toxic level, but I'm aware that if it's taken forward to extreme levels, so if it's used as a way of reframing employees' concerns or legitimate grievances, then I think that's what would be meant by it being a toxic level of positivity. And there's also something that this relates to my research around mindfulness, which is this idea of what I call digital disembodiment. And I think this is an area that's become more and more relevant as we've become more and more married to our digital devices, less grounded within our own experience, physical experience of living our lives on a day-to-day basis. There's a couple of areas. And I think that the final one is a greater recognition of coaching as having a systemic role within organisations as well. So the role of coaching in actually being able to carry forward positive conversations and challenge some of the workplace practices that maybe coaches are experiencing that might be contributing to a lack of well-being within the workforce.
Well, fascinating. So, I mean, there's three quite chunky themes, I think, that you've just shared there that I just want to scratch a bit further. So, positive toxicity. So, can't get my mouth around that one. So, share a bit more about that. How does that sort of play out in an organisational sense?
Toxic positivity. Yes,
that would be helpful if I wrote it the right way down. Toxic positivity. There we go. So, there you go. Just to prove this is live.
Yeah, well, I guess it's something that I've been exploring and been interested in, just in terms of workplace systems and processes that might potentially reinforce or collude with practice that might be detrimental to workplace well-being. So I think my understanding of toxic positivity would be that it's where there's a lack of psychologically safe spaces for people within the workforce to actually have their experiences heard in an honest and truthful way. And there's a desire to reframe those experiences positively. So it's about encouraging staff to look at how can you turn that into a positive, rather than actually hearing the challenge that the particular member of staff or staff as a group are sharing. And I think there is potentially a challenge for coaching in that it not necessarily knowingly, but it can collude in that process if you're using an approach to coaching that is very strongly focused around reframing positive processes and being forward moving in terms of end goals and those kind of issues.
No, thanks for that. I don't think I'll forget that it's toxic positivity now, will I? I'll never forget that. So that's interesting. And then that sort of plays into that space of disempowerment that you talked about. And then you also shared about digital disembodiment. So I've never heard that before, and hopefully I've got that the right way around. So share with us a bit about that, because that's fascinating.
So disembodiment is a term that's well studied within mindfulness research and mindfulness literature. It's really this idea that when we're not being mindful in how we live our lives, we're becoming more disembodied. So we're becoming more separated from our physical and our lived experience of our lives through our senses, for example. So a big part of mindfulness, as it's practiced in the workplace and lots of programs, is about us learning to listen to our physical experience. So it's becoming re-embodied and experiencing our physical selves, our sensory selves more, and becoming more in tune with that. And I think the digital side of this for me is that the role that digital devices play in perpetuating this process of disembodiment for us. And if you think about it from the perspective of well-being in the workplace, email would be a good example. So people whose days are governed by trying to get their email inbox clear, or being distracted by having several devices that are calling for their attention at once, whether it's a tablet and a mobile phone and your laptop or whatever it might be. So I think I'm really interested in this idea of how we can create a process of helping people to stay more embodied in the workplace as a way of contributing to their well-being as well.
I certainly have to make sure that I switch off my phone. I do love an email. The other one that you mentioned was around coaching and its systemic role. And there's a real move towards that, looking at the workplace, but looking at the whole system that people are within. So what are you seeing in that sort of space then?
I think it's a really interesting area, Darren. I think there's potentially a level of conflict within coaching, and a healthy level of conflict, and maybe a debate is a better term to use, between those coaches who would see the role of the coach as being to come and work within an organisation, but for there to be very clear boundaries between what clients mention in sessions and what they're then the conversations they might be having with the sponsor, the organisation. And then perhaps coaches working more as internal coaches within organisations who are getting a sense of themes that are arising from the coaching work that they're doing with staff. For me, there's an interesting and I think probably ethical issue there for us as coaches about what happens with that information. And if we're coaching in an organisation and we are having themes coming up recurrently that have an impact on for staff and those kind of areas, that how we use that information or how we add to the conversation at an organisational level around developing a better understanding of what might be needed for staff wellbeing, for staff support, those kind of things.
Thanks for that. No, that's really interesting. I think one of the areas that I've recently become more attuned to with my AC hat on is around safeguarding, because we've had a couple of members that have come to us and said one of the client sponsors has asked for data that I'm capturing. I'm really looking at this area at the moment. So I'd love you to unpick some of the ethical challenges that you're seeing, because it really does play into, literally, I was looking at a document this morning about safeguarding and what are the rights and the reasons, and because it's coming up as a bit of a challenge for a number of coaches. Share what your research and your observations are.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Having worked in the public sector in prisons and probation and in the health service, I've worked with organisations that have a really clear policy around the limits of confidentiality when you're working with clients. And my understanding, I work with the Association for Coaching Code of Ethics and Conduct. My understanding is that it would be the same for a coach. The way that we contract with staff where I work, and also how I would contract with staff privately, is that the limitations of confidentiality would be where there's a acknowledged risk of harm to self or others. So I think that's, for me, safeguarding is perhaps a separate issue to how you might use information that's coming out of coaching sessions constructively to inform perhaps organisational or systemic conversations about areas such as employee well-being. I think if you're talking about the limitations of disclosure in relation to safeguarding issues, then for me, the guidance is fairly clear on that. But I would always obviously say as well that it should be a conversation that you have with your HR department at work as well about what the safeguarding policy is for the organisation that you're working with.
in terms of the thematics, I think most coaches are, well, those that have worked at the sort of executive and team coaching level are very comfortable with that. I think that's often part of the agreement, is that actually we're not looking to disclose personal conversations, but what we are listening to do when we do live 360s, as a for instance, you pick up on some pretty key themes, both for the individual, the team that you're in, but also at the broader team level and cultural level as well. So I think that there's an understanding that those things are shared and can be shared. Where else are some of the other, when you look at things through an ethical lens, where are some of the other challenges that you see?
Well, I guess I would, in terms of what you were saying there, Darren, about there being an understanding, I would say perhaps more so if you're working as an external coach coming into an organisation. I think where it's less clear, and maybe there is scope to explore it more, is if you work as an internal coach, because there's a sense, I think, and this applies to mindfulness, this applies to coaching, resilience, that it's a good thing, isn't it? So why wouldn't we do it? So there's almost an assumption that this is going to be something that's a positive experience for the recipients of the service. So I think it's an interesting conversation, one that we've been having as an internal coach, around how the role itself and how information that's coming out might be used, whilst also being really mindful and aware of the confidentiality, the rights to confidentiality of the staff. And I think that's a big value for coaching, isn't it? That, and any helping profession, that people can come in and they can speak honestly and openly and trust that information is going to be shared and kept within the session and not shared. So it's more about how do we look at how coaching as a profession can be engaged in conversations within organisations around areas such as health and well-being. And I'm thinking maybe more about people like Hetty Ising here, at the top end of that scale, who are having conversations about how coaching should be contributing to conversations around things like environmental awareness and sustainability and those kind of issues as well. For me, there's a conversation there also about well-being and employee well-being within the workplace.
Yeah, no, 100%. And funny enough, within the Association for Coaching, the podcast, the next one that I do is going to be in June, is going to be tackling those subjects for 2 months. So we're going to be interviewing people around those subjects. So you didn't know that. And so it gives me an opportunity to share that, which is, I think, is really critical. So when you think about some of the challenges we've talked about here, when you think about what you were sharing at the very beginning around your approach is to look at being and doing, what's some of the differences that you bring in to support people? Because we're massive fans and advocates for supervision, professional reflective practice, as we like to see it, because it's so important. And I think that safe space you create as a coach is really essential to help someone when they're experiencing something that's difficult. That's actually a really good place for them to share it and then think about, so what's the learning for me in there? Not trying to spin it into something positive. What do you see and what do you do that's a bit different? How do you bring that sort of being and doing and that mindfulness into the coaching that you bring to the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And I think this is something that, just to give you a bit of context as well, Darren, this is something that I became aware of, but I didn't realise that it was part of mindfulness practice when I was working as a psychologist. So I was involved with treatments such as acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, and dialectical behavioural therapy, or DBT, which draw on aspects of mindfulness to help clients work more within this idea of being mode as opposed to doing mode. I guess the ways that I would use this in my coaching are around helping clients to start to make more conscious choices around how they experience thoughts and feelings. And a big part of that is recognizing that the thoughts we have are events rather than being our reality, and that they are changeable, that they are impermanent, and that they pass. And if you've ever tried any of the kind of mindfulness meditations, a big part of that is about encouraging a focus on the present moment and an acknowledgement of your thoughts and feelings as being present, but not necessarily things that you have to follow or go off in a certain direction with. So being mode in that sense is very much about being able to stand back a little bit from your thoughts, your feelings, your sensory experiences of an event, and to try and explore things in a sort of open-minded way. So it's a very approach-focused, if you like, way of looking at things rather than avoiding, which is also one of the things that I think can make mindfulness practice quite challenging for people, certainly when you first start doing it, because what you're doing is you're trying to sit with stuff that's quite difficult to think about or feel, and that can be quite challenging. And I think it's also about supporting people to engage in things that are very nourishing for them, rather than focusing on things that are probably contributing to a sense of a lack of well-being. So yeah, that's some of the ways in which I think there's a difference between being in being mode with a client and in doing mode.
I think it's really interesting. I've got another question for you to help to bring it to life even further, because mindfulness has come up a couple of times. And after this, I'll send you the paper that I've been sent, which looks at the study, which you might already know about, where they've put people in a room for 15 minutes to see if they could be with their thoughts. And 75% of men electrocuted themselves, took the opportunity to electrocute themselves, and 25% of women. So it says that as human beings, especially men, quite struggle with it. And Hilary and Dr. Ashley have got a VR mindfulness tool that they're using, and they can show that the research is coming from Aston University. The 6 minutes of doing this actually really helps them to be more productive, which is great. So it's definitely one worth to listen to. When you start working with somebody and haven't used mindfulness, how do you introduce it? How do you use it in your sessions? What sort of things do you ask them to do in the session? And then the other thing is, how do you help them to build it into micro habits, which is one of the big themes from this series, is the importance of your daily habits, your daily micro habits. So how do you use it? How will you be in that? And then how do you help them to actually use that as a tool that they can use consistently?
It's a great question. I would say the only way that you can really teach mindfulness to other people is to do it yourself. So it's like learning to swim or riding a bike. You can read as many books on it as you like, but until you actually start practicing it yourself, then it's very hard to actually take somebody else through that process as well. So it doesn't surprise me when you mentioned about that study that people were struggling perhaps with the process of sitting with their own thoughts or feelings. So mindfulness is a practice. It's not something that you turn on or off. It's not a tool or a technique, in my opinion. It's actually a practice, and it's a process that takes time. It's something that you ideally should practice every day. And it's really part of a wider process of us learning to be more accepting of other people, to be more compassionate, to be less egocentric and driven by our own needs, to be able to let go of things more and turn towards things that we find challenging. In terms of coaching, and this is what I teach students on the postgraduate certificate that we run at Montfort, it's not so much that you're having a tool that you take into a coaching session, it's how you can use mindfulness to help you as a coach in the ways that you're working with your clients, but also to improve the relational space that you have when you're coaching your clients as well. I'm afraid I'm not going to advocate particular techniques or tools that I think would be helpful without saying that first and foremost, if anyone wants to do it, they should go away. They should do an 8-week program. There's loads of programs out there, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, mindfulness-based stress reduction. There's ones that have a much more explicit focus on ethics and the spiritual element of mindfulness, which is more aligned with the Buddhist practice of mindfulness as well. So I think it's about what it brings to your coaching practice. And I think it's about what you can then use in the space with your clients to help them to sit with things. And there are exercises that you can do from this, but I would be wary of doing that in isolation outside of actually encouraging the client to go away and develop their own practice as well. So I don't know if that feels like I'm skirting around the issue a little bit. I'm not trying to, but that's something that I believe really strongly in. I think there's a risk that if you introduce something without it being a process that you're familiar with and you do, and it's something that the client can be committed to doing. There are papers out there that demonstrate there's the potential for a risk of harm to clients, particularly clients that might have a level of mental health problem currently, clients that might be suffering with depression or anxiety. There are caveats for how this is done, in my view.
Yeah, no, I think as always, I think if you're serious about mindfulness, then put it as part of your CPD, your professional development, and learn it and go in depth on it. So I think that's absolutely the right thing to suggest. So I didn't think you were skirting. Whilst you were talking, I went and found the paper. So it's called Just Think, The Challenges of the Disengaged Mind. So there you go. For anyone that paper has been mentioned a few times, but not the name. So Just Think, The Challenges of the Disengaged Mind. So I'll send it to you, Stephen, because I think you'll find it really fascinating. And then back into pragmatics and practicals. You were sharing earlier that when you look at the systems and where people don't feel that they've got a safe space and where there is this drive towards, what was it we called it again? Toxic positivity. When people are working with you and you are working with them in this sort of space of being and doing and mindfulness, what are some of the things that they report? What are some of the improvements that they're seeing?
Oh, I think there's lots of research out there as to what the benefits of mindfulness practice can be if you teach it to people. So you mentioned a couple there, I think, in relation to one of the studies, which are it improves our attention span, improves our ability to concentrate. It can help us to develop our sense of self-compassion, our compassion for others as well. So I think that it's something that you can use with people to help them manage anxiety around workplace challenges. Presentations always a good one. Lots of people don't like doing presentations and standing up and speaking in front of people. I guess my interest with it is more from the perspective of the wider impact of mindfulness practice within the system in the workplace. So I'm more interested in the benefits of people. So part of my research is looking at carrying out a mindfulness program with staff within a business school and then following them up for a year and looking at the impact it has on things like interpersonal relationships and the culture of working with each other within the school. And does it have a wider impact beyond just an individual in terms of positive workplace relationships and practices as well? And for me, that's part of the challenge with this, is that there's a concern that mindfulness is being used. It could be argued that mindfulness, a bit like resilience, could be used as something that would locate responsibility for systemic issues with an individual rather than an organisation taking the appropriate level of responsibility. So it's a bit like saying, who doesn't want to be more mindful? Who doesn't want to be more resilient? But some of the concerns that are raised around this is if you practice something like mindfulness without considering the wider ethical perspectives around the process, because fundamentally from a Buddhist point of view, mindfulness, there's a right mindfulness and there's a wrong mindfulness. There's a way of drawing on your experiences to help other people and to become a less ego-driven individual. And there's mindfulness, as it's taught a lot in the West, which is entirely around us as individuals. It's a very ego-driven process. So that's my interest around this, is the ethical perspective of how do we use this process, not to reinforce our sense of I, but to look at how it might actually benefit workplace culture and people's ability to work better with each other and be kinder to each other and be more understanding, those kind of areas.
Yeah, no, fascinating. I really love the way you've actually captured that. And I spent Thursday listening to the Climate Coaching Alliance. So I joined that 24-hour marathon. Well, I joined about 14 hours of it. And it was fascinating to listen to it. And I think it really is. So John Whitmore and Hetty, they did transpersonal psychology. They brought that to the AC back in 2003-4, I think it was, or maybe 5. And that was all from the I to the we. And I think that one of my takeaways from the CCA event was that, as humanity, we really do need to grow up and see that we're all interconnected and part of that wider we. It's great to hear. It's great to hear, but it's also surprising. I'd never heard it encapsulated in the way you have around the fact that in the West, we're using mindfulness from a place of I, whereas the Buddhists, it's much more about the we, the interconnected. I'd never heard that before. So that was new news to me. So thank you for sharing that piece.
I wouldn't profess to be a Buddhist scholar by any means. That I'm still, very much a complete novice around learning around Buddhism. But mindfulness within Buddhism, as I do understand it, is only part of the process. Whereas as it's taught in the West, it is the process. And mindfulness is in and of itself the means to an end and the end itself. So yeah, I think this is where, and there are lots of people out there, lots of interesting articles you could read around. The phrase that springs to mind is something called mindfulness, which is a phrase that I think it was coined by Ron Purser a few years ago, which is this idea of the commodification of what was essentially a spiritual practice by the West. And there are other perspectives, obviously, that would argue against that. I'm not saying that's the only perspective to hold on this, but it's an interest from the point of view of thinking about workplace mindfulness. I'm quite interested in the risks inherent in using something which I think, if we're being honest, the evidence base outside of clinical settings for its effectiveness is a bit more sketchy. I think it's very legitimate to ask questions of its relevance, its applicability within the workplace, and are we doing things right in the way that we're using it?
No, wonderful. And just to focus in on an area that is of real fascination and growing interest for you is your PhD. So what's the title of your PhD?
I'm only in year 2 of a part-time one. So it's the role of mindfulness on staff wellbeing in the workplace, brackets, in a UK business school. But I think that the title is the bit you come to last for the PhD once you've done the rest of the stuff. But yeah, so there's 3 areas to it. I'm really interested in looking at so-called ethical mindfulness approaches within the workplace. So there's a guy called Gordon van Dam, who I think works at Nottingham Trent University, who's produced some really interesting research around what he's described as second generation mindfulness-based interventions, or SGMBIs, which are mindfulness-based programs that have a much more explicit acknowledgement of the ethical processes in mindfulness, and a more overtly, acknowledging of the spiritual influences on mindfulness, which a lot of secular mindfulness programs don't do for various reasons. So I'm really interested in looking at the sort of impact of those approaches within the workplace. And then hopefully at some point when we are able to actually get back in a room with other people and share the same space, my plan is to actually run a couple of mindfulness programs, second generation mindfulness-based programs within a workspace, and use that as an opportunity to actually just follow up with the participants and really explore their lived experience of learning mindfulness, how they make sense of that, and what meaning they make of that within the workplace over the course of 12 to 18 months.
No, fascinating. And I got that phrase Ronseal, it's, I know the title will change as it develops, but it's pretty clear. And sometimes you don't necessarily get that from the title of a PhD. So it's fairly clear the direction of travel. One final question really then. So I know that you really love David Clutterbuck's paper. And we talked earlier about democratization of coaching, and that coaching is starting to grow and develop in all different areas of organizations. And I think also society, which I think is really exciting. He talks about how does coaching remain relevant as we move forward. So what are some of your final thoughts in that space?
The paper that I've referred to, I've got it here in front of me, Challenging Times for Coaches, something that I think he produced last year. It's produced by the David Clutterbuck Partnership. I'm not paid by David Clutterbuck, by the way, to promote this, but I think it's a fantastic paper. And I think, a lot of the issues raised in this are ones that resonate for me. And I think they're ones that perhaps were relevant when I was working as a psychologist as well. So things like the rise of AI in coaching. There's a suggestion in the paper that there are coaching programs out there now that can take a client through the GROW model, the classic John Whitmore model, just as well as any beginning novice coach could do. So for me, I think coaching has to be more than the GROW model. It has to be more than solution focused. It has to be more than just taking people through a fairly linear process of start to end. And I'm really confident that coaching will do that. I think it is doing it. I think there are these conversations that are being had. You mentioned about the forum that you were, the 24-hour forum. And so I think it's embracing it in some quarters, but I think there's a sense from other quarters of we shouldn't be doing this as coaches and this isn't our place. So it's really interesting conversations and discussions coming out of that. I think the other thing that really I find quite interesting is something that Clutterbuck refers to as the decolonisation of coaching. And we're in the process where I work of decolonising our curriculum. And having worked with the NHS previously, one of the criticisms perhaps of counselling services has been that they've typically been delivered from a very Western, middle-class, white perspective. And I think the same accusation perhaps could be levelled at coaching as well. So I'm really interested to see how coaching might develop in terms of really engaging with other cultures and really decolonising our approach to it and challenging the very kind of Western perspective, the Eurocentric perspective that we might have about a lot of our practices as well. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting area. So yeah, I think they would probably be the two main things for me.
No, fantastic. I just thought it'd be a nice sort of bookend to this conversation, which I've thoroughly enjoyed. So for those people that have found this conversation stimulating, where can they find you? So how do people get in contact with you?
So I'm on LinkedIn as Stephen Baguley. I'm also a member of staff at Montfort University, and I have a staff profile there. I don't have a web page or anything like that at this point in time, but I'm also teaching on the postgraduate certificate in professional coaching, which is run through the Leicester Castle Business School. So if people are interested in hearing more about that as well, then please do get in touch. Just one more thing, if I can just say really quickly, this was on my list and I forgot to mention it. Having come from an allied health profession background, I'm really keen for coaches that there's the opportunity for people that are interested in coaching, but also in how people work, to draw from psychology and psychiatry and neuroscience and organisational psychology. And I'm a big advocate of that. I know there are some people that argue that there's the risk of blurring boundaries between things like coaching and counselling. And I'm aware that there are training events advertised now for things like coaching through bereavement and coaching with trauma, which traditionally have been seen as being areas that were only strictly the domain of a counsellor or a psychotherapist. But I think it's really important for coaches to be able to understand human behaviour. So I would absolutely advocate and recommend that if people are interested in learning about how we operate, how we tick, going out there and learning more about models of human behavior, whether they're from a psychological background or they're from a sociological background. I think coaching has the opportunity to draw all this stuff into it and do it in a wonderfully eclectic and diverse way. So long may that continue.
And 100% agree with you. And myself, Catherine and Alex and a whole load of people within the AC, we're very close to Sir John Whitmore. And John used to say we would have done our job when people stopped talking about coaching. I think it's the natural unfolding process, and rejoice in it, to be honest with you. I think it's very exciting for our profession as it becomes more of a profession. And I think we have to show up wholeheartedly and as a whole person to support someone, very much in alignment with that. So Stephen, I really appreciate your time today. Really enjoyed this session and look forward to seeing how your work unfolds. Thanks for your time.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me, Darren. Bye-bye.